Usually when you hear the phrase separation of church and state, there's like an immediate, almost reflexive expectation of what that looks like.
Oh, absolutely.
We picture a massive, impenetrable brick wall, right? On one side, you have the government making laws, building roads, and collecting taxes.
Right.
And on the other side, you have religion just quietly keeping to itself in sanctuaries and homes. It's a two-way street. They do not cross into each other's lanes.
Yeah, that is the standard modern secular assumption. I mean, it's
Yeah.
clean, it's binary, and we tend to think of it as a perfectly symmetrical barrier where both sides just mutually agree to leave each other alone.
Exactly. But what if that wall was never supposed to be a solid brick barrier at all? What if, at its inception, it was actually designed as a one-way valve?
A one-way valve.
Yeah, a system where the state is strictly locked out of the church, but the church and civil society as a whole is explicitly supposed to flow freely into the public square, acting as a moral supervisor to the government.
Right, which completely changes the dynamic.
It really does. And even more provocatively, if you shut off that valve and aggressively push traditional religion out of the public square, does the square stay empty? Or does a new, unofficial state religion rush in to fill the void?
I mean, those are massive, structurally foundational questions. They really challenge the core assumptions most people hold about how modern democratic societies are supposed to function.
Which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We are exploring excerpts from a highly critical book called 2025 U.S. Launches Correction by Young Kang.
Right, specifically a chapter that maps out the evolution, or maybe the devolution, depending on your perspective, of church-state relations in the U.S.
Yeah, the devolution.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into the weeds, I do want to put a crucial disclaimer out there for you listening. This source material contains deeply conservative, highly politically charged views.
Very charged, yeah. On American history, the judicial system, and modern cultural issues.
Exactly. So our goal today is not to take sides. We are not here to endorse these viewpoints or preach to you. Our mission is just to impartially map out the architecture of this specific conservative critique.
Because unpacking the mechanics of a worldview is entirely different from agreeing with it.
Right.
Mapping out how this perspective connects historical dots from 1776 all the way to modern cancel culture reveals a lot about the tectonic plates shifting beneath our current political discourse.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand this architecture, we have to start where the author starts. The text roots this whole argument in the American founding, claiming the original Anglo-American design was a one-way separation. How does that one-way valve actually work in practice?
Well, the author introduces a concept that kind of flips the modern secular understanding on its head. In this view, the government and the church are indeed separate institutions, but both are fundamentally meant to acknowledge a higher transcendent authority.
Like God's sovereignty.
Yes. The critical mechanism at play here is about the allocation of power. So the state possesses the power of coercion. It controls the military, the police, the prisons, taxation.
The heavy machinery.
Exactly. But importantly, the author argues, the state does not inherently possess moral authority.
So it's almost like the state is the engine of a car. It provides the raw, coercive horsepower to make the society run, but it doesn't get to steer.
That is a perfect way to visualize it, actually. And the church, along with civil society, they are supposed to act as the steering wheel and the brakes.
The engine doesn't get to decide the destination or what's right and wrong. It just executes the mechanics of moving forward.
Right, because the state only has that raw horsepower, the author argues that moral authority must reside in civil society. In the churches, the businesses, the public.
So it's their fundamental duty to supervise and critique the government.
Yes, because if political power and religious authority merge into the state, the author warns, might simply becomes right. I mean, politicians aren't inherently virtuous just because they win an election.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
So faith and morality have to sit above politics, keeping the engine in check.
And the text points out that this wasn't just some fringe theoretical idea, right? It was baked deeply into the culture of the time.
Oh, absolutely. The author notes that during the American Revolution, Massachusetts was the absolute epicenter of the rebellion, but was also a massive stronghold for devout Puritan Congregationalists.
Wait, before we move past that, what did being a Puritan Congregationalist actually mean for the average person back then, and why does the author highlight them?
So the mechanism of their belief system is really key here. Congregationalists believed in highly localized, independent church governance. They were deeply suspicious of top-down, centralized power.
Whether from a king or a pope.
Exactly. Because their theology emphasized that human beings are inherently flawed and sinful, they deeply believed that any centralized government needed strict moral restraint. The church needed the power to restrain the state, not the other way around.
Which brings us to the First Amendment. You know, the famous words, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof."
Right.
People often think the phrase separation of church and state is right there in the Constitution, but it really isn't, is it?
No, not at all. It's a much later interpretation. The author highlights that the First Amendment was created for a very specific, pragmatic reason.
Not some philosophical desire to banish religion.
Exactly. After the Protestant Reformation, the early U.S. was filled with competing denominations. They realized that if the federal government established a national church, one specific denomination would get all the coercive power.
And the others would be severely disadvantaged.
Right. So the amendment was designed just to prevent a federal monopoly on religion. In fact, religion was still deeply embedded at the state and local levels.
There are some fascinating historical anecdotes in the source that really drive this home. The author mentions that during the Constitutional Convention, the tension over religious favoritism was so high it nearly collapsed the whole project.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin actually suggested they start each day with a prayer to seek God's blessing, just as they did in the Continental Congress.
But they ultimately had to abandon the idea, not because they were anti-religion, but simply because picking a minister from one specific denomination might look like they were favoring a national church.
Exactly. And then you look at James Madison, the principal architect of the Constitution. He had to constantly reassure the anti-federalists that leaving religious liberty out of the original draft wasn't a trick to suppress it.
Because they were fiercely protective of state and individual rights.
Right. Madison even called the creation of the Constitution a miracle guided by God. He argued it was hard to imagine humanity pulling it off without divine guidance.
Wow. So in the author's view, this one-way street created a golden age. The state stayed completely out of the church's business.
Yes, which meant church courts lost their coercive power and dissolved into secular law. There were no state-sponsored heretics.
And because the state lacked the justification to interfere in religion, it essentially lost its jurisdiction to interfere in intellectual affairs at all.
Exactly. The author argues this structural setup led to the complete liberation of human thought. It fostered an era of flourishing diversity, high moral standards, and fair competition among religious groups.
Building schools and hospitals, that sort of thing.
Yeah. It resulted in complete freedom of the soul, which the author views as the ultimate key to human dignity.
Okay, so if this system was working so beautifully, according to the author, where the engine hums along and society steers, why on earth did the government decide to dismantle it? How does the source explain the shift to what the author calls a reversed one-way state?
Well, the source points to the period right after World War II as the beginning of a massive institutional shift. The author argues this was driven by a rising leftist liberal ideology. They note that the Democratic Party controlled Congress for roughly 60 years, from 1934 to 1994. And during this prolonged period, the author claims the walls of limited government were systematically dismantled.
And a pivotal mechanism for this shift was the 1954 Johnson Amendment, right?
Yes, proposed by Lyndon B. Johnson before he was president.
How did a tax code change dismantle this moral steering wheel?
It modified Section 501c3 of the U.S. Tax Code. It stated that tax-exempt organizations, which crucially includes all churches, would completely lose that tax-exempt status if they engaged in any political activity.
Wait, so no supporting or opposing candidates?
Right, or openly expressing political positions.
Wow, so the government basically weaponized the IRS. They told pastors and moral leaders, you can keep your financial viability, but only if you completely shut up about politics.
That is exactly the mechanism the author highlights. By holding their tax-exempt status hostage, the government created a massive chilling effect.
Pastors became terrified of the IRS.
Yeah, they deliberately avoided talking about controversial social issues from the pulpit, things like abortion, euthanasia, or stem cell research, out of fear that the government would retaliate financially.
So the state suddenly started dictating what civil society was allowed to say.
Exactly.
But wait, let's test this argument for a second. Someone looking back at the 50s and 60s might say that removing religion from public spaces, like public schools, wasn't some grand conspiracy to silence pastors.
Right.
It was about protecting religious minorities. If you have Jewish, Muslim, or atheist students in a public classroom, isn't state-sponsored Christian prayer a violation of their rights? How does the author reconcile that?
Well, the author views that argument as a guise for state overreach, and they point the finger directly at the judicial branch to explain how it happened.
The Supreme Court?
Yes, the author lists a barrage of Supreme Court cases from 1948 to 1992, arguing the court forcefully intervened in citizens' faith by radically reinterpreting the Establishment Clause. Take the 1962 case, Engel v. Vital, which prohibited public prayer in schools. The court's logic shifted from the government cannot fund a national church to the government cannot endorse any religious sentiment at all.
Because even voluntary prayer exerts coercive peer pressure on minorities.
Exactly. And the author sees that shift in legal interpretation as an aggressive expansion of state power.
Just scrubbing traditional faith from the public square.
Right. And they point to the 1985 case, Wallace v. Jaffrey, as the ultimate proof of this absurdity. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that even holding a voluntary moment of silence in schools was unconstitutional.
Wait, just a moment of silence?
Yes, because they said it was essentially a disguised form of prayer.
So what does this all mean? The court essentially ruled that an absence of noise was an unconstitutional religious act.
Yep.
I can see how the author views that as a huge leap from don't fund a national church to you can't sit quietly for 60 seconds.
When you step back and look at the picture the author is painting, it's a narrative of a government that spent the second half of the 20th century actively silencing religious moral critique.
Telling the church to stay out of politics while expanding its own power. But nature abhors a vacuum. If the state successfully shuts off that valve and traditional moral authority is entirely pushed out by the 90s, society still needs a steering wheel.
It does.
So what does the author claim filled that moral vacuum in the 21st century?
What's fascinating here is the author's most provocative claim. They argue the vacuum was not filled by secular neutrality. It was filled by a new, highly intolerant religion.
The new religion.
Yeah, the author claims the United States is currently transforming into a confessional state.
Let's define that for a second. A confessional state means a government that officially merges with a specific, mandatory ideological creed, right?
Correct. A state that does not allow the existence of competing beliefs. And according to the author, this new state religion is not a traditional theology.
It's political correctness and leftist liberal ideology.
Exactly. And the source specifically targets critical race theory, or CRT, as the core dogma of this new religion.
The author calls it an ideological weapon, right? Designed to subvert American institutions. They argue CRT dictates that a person's destiny isn't determined by their character or effort, but entirely by their race.
Right.
But CRT is a massive, complex, academic framework. How does the author illustrate this for the everyday citizen?
To demonstrate how paralyzing this ideology is in practice, the author cites a thought experiment from the educational media outlet PragerU.
Oh, I've heard of this one.
Yeah. Picture this scenario. You run a small retail shop, and two customers walk in at the exact same time. One is black and one is white. Who do you choose to serve first?
Okay, let's work through this trap. If I choose to serve the black customer first, the CRT ideology dictates I'm a racist because I must subconsciously view them as a security risk and want them out of my store as quickly as possible.
Exactly. And if you choose to serve the white customer first,
then I'm treating the white customer as a priority and the black customer as a second-class citizen.
yeah,
Which is also racist. So it's a completely unwinnable scenario. You are morally paralyzed no matter what action you take.
the author uses this scenario to argue that under this new creed, citizens are trapped in an absurd, chaotic maze. No matter your intentions, you are accused of being controlled by racist ideology.
It functions like a system of original sin.
Yes, but critically, without any possibility of redemption.
And every fundamentalist religion needs a mechanism to deal with heretics. So what is the modern excommunication? Cancel culture.
The author describes cancel culture as a modern, covert form of violence. I mean, we don't physically eliminate heretics anymore, but we strip them of their livelihood.
Losing your job, being banned on social media platforms.
Facing intense personal threats for defying the creed of political correctness. And he also points out that this new orthodoxy is rigorously enforced by modern institutions.
Like the mainstream media, Hollywood, corporate HR departments, and most notably, universities. Here's where it gets really interesting. The author isn't just complaining about culture wars. They are making a deeper philosophical argument about the nature of justice and the arc of human progress.
Yeah, they bring in a quote from Sir Henry Summer Maine, an English jurist who wrote, "Social progress is the evolution from identity to contract."
We need to translate that because the author hinges a massive part of their argument on this concept.
Well, Maine argues that an identity society is one where your rights, obligations, and place in the world are determined entirely by what group you belong to, your race, your origin, your class.
So it's a society of fatalism where everything is predestined by birth. It's almost like a rigid caste system.
Right.
Or maybe an old school role-playing game where your character class is permanently locked in at birth. Your group dictates everything you can and cannot do.
Exactly. But a contract society, on the other hand, is like a free market startup.
Okay.
Your value, your rights, and your progress are based entirely on the agreements you actively negotiate as an individual, regardless of where you started.
That analogy perfectly captures the author's view. A contract society is the hallmark of Western civilization. It's egalitarian, competitive, and relies on the rule of law.
And by pushing identity politics, the author argues that modern progressives are not advancing society. They are forcing it to regress.
Backward into a fragmented tribal identity system.
Right, that eventually degrades into barbarism because people just build walls and view their neighbors as inherent adversaries.
But the author goes after some major sacred cows here to make this point. They heavily criticize the equal opportunity movement and modern philosophers like Princeton's John Rawls.
Yes, Rawls is a major target.
The author points out that Rawls famously advocated that rights take precedence over the good and that justice is fairness. What does rights take precedence over the good actually mean in plain English?
It means that abstract concepts of fairness, equity, and individual rights should override traditional moral frameworks, what society historically defined as the good.
So Rawls believed society should artificially balance the scales to ensure equal outcomes.
Right. And the author dismisses this as rational arrogance. They argue that modern liberalism overestimates human reason, trying to artificially engineer social justice, rather than adhering to an objective, higher truth.
And the author counters this engineered social justice with biblical justice.
Yes, they bring in a quote from Lord Acton. Sympathy and love can lead people to overlook justice and favor sin. This is the most insidious danger, and most humanitarian disasters stem from it.
That is a massive statement. They are literally arguing that trying too hard to be compassionate through systemic policy leads to disaster.
To understand the mechanism of that argument, you have to look at the biblical texts the author cites. Leviticus 19:15 commands, "Do not show partiality to the poor or favor the powerful. Judge your neighbor in righteousness."
The core message is that true justice must be completely blind.
Exactly. It cannot be tipped to favor a specific identity or group, even if that group is historically vulnerable.
Unconditionally favoring the weak, the author argues, is often just a way for people to demonstrate their own moral superiority.
And it ultimately hinders the vulnerable group's long-term development by making them dependent.
So in a modern context, it's like a teacher grading a math test. If a student from a severely disadvantaged background gets the answer completely wrong, sympathy might make the teacher want to give them passing marks anyway.
Just to be compassionate, right?
But Acton and the author are saying that doing so destroys the objective concept of math, hurts that specific student's long-term intellectual development, and completely undermines the fairness of the grading system for everyone else.
Yes. The author believes that by usurping God's objective, blind justice with a subjective, identity-based social justice, we destroy the foundation of fair competition.
And our ability to speak freely.
Exactly.
It reminds me of how the author contrasts the old and new definitions of free speech to summarize this entire cultural shift.
Oh, the swinging the fist analogy.
Yeah. Classical liberals used to operate by a very physical, objective rule. Your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. But today, the author argues, progressive ideology has changed the rule to something entirely subjective. Your freedom of expression ends where my feelings begin.
And if speech that might theoretically offend someone's feelings is strictly forbidden, well, we eventually have nothing left we are allowed to say.
Wow. And that enforced silence, the author warns, is the dark abyss of the confessional state.
A society unified only by fear, censorship, and intellectual conformity, rather than genuine moral virtue or debate.
What a sweeping journey this source material takes us on. We started with the author's idealized vision of a one-way valve in 1776, where the government stayed out of faith, allowing society to freely steer the state.
Right.
Then we mapped the 20th century, where legislative threats like the Johnson Amendment and a barrage of Supreme Court rulings shut off that valve, silencing moral critique.
And finally, we arrived at the author's stark warning for the 21st century, that the vacuum has been filled by a new state religion of identity politics.
one that is dragging society backward from a civilized contract system into a fragmented tribal identity system.
It is a profound, albeit deeply polarizing map of American history. But examining this text matters to you, the listener, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
When you understand how conservative thinkers mechanically connect the dots between early religious freedom, the expansion of post-war institutional power, and modern critical race theory, you gain the ability to decode the subtext of today's debates.
You really begin to see the philosophical architecture beneath the daily shouting. It takes you out of the daily outrage cycle on social media and lets you see the actual tectonic plates shifting underneath.
Gives you a much broader perspective.
And to wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on something the author noted about universities. The author claims that today, academic institutions are acting as the custodians of intellectual orthodoxy.
Rigidly enforcing this new creed of political correctness, functioning very much like the powerful church authorities did in the Middle Ages.
Exactly. So here's the thought for you to explore on your own. If our modern institutions of higher learning and mainstream media are functioning as the new cathedrals of our era, enforcing a very specific moral creed and excommunicating heretics,
How does a society correct its course?
right, how does it correct course when the clergy and academia and the everyday public completely lose a shared vocabulary for what constitutes the truth?
If we can no longer agree on the baseline facts of reality, how do we even begin to have a conversation about moving forward?
It's a huge question. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical and philosophical arguments of this provocative source. Keep exploring and keep questioning the narratives that shape your world.